Eleanor Whitmore Graves set her husband's untouched dinner plate back in the kitchen for the 365th time, and she did not cry. She had cried enough. She had waited enough. And tonight, for the first time in a year of marriage, a man looked at her across a crowded summer room and smiled like she was worth seeing. That was the night Nathaniel Graves learned the most dangerous truth a proud man can learn too late. If you're new here, subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 came to Boston the way it always did, sudden, heavy, and unannounced, like a creditor at the door. The Graves estate on Beacon Hill sat high above the harbor, its white columns catching the late afternoon heat, its rooms full of the kind of quiet that wasn't peace. It was the quiet of two people who had learned very carefully how not to speak to each other. Eleanor had learned it faster. She'd had more practice at surviving silence. She was standing in the east corridor when she heard Nathaniel's bootsteps on the staircase, the particular cadence she'd memorized, the way you memorize the sound of a storm before it reaches you, measured, controlled, never hurried. She adjusted the small vase of summer wildflowers on the hall table and did not turn around. "The Aldridge party arrives at 7, she said. His steps paused. "I'm aware." "Mrs. Hargrove sent a note. She expects you to give the welcome address." "I'll manage it." That was the full conversation. 17 words between husband and wife on the morning of the largest social event their household had hosted since their wedding the previous July. Eleanor kept her eyes on the wildflowers. They were blue and gold. She'd picked them herself from the South Meadow that morning, because the florist in town had sent lilies again, and she couldn't stand lilies. Nobody had ever asked her what she preferred. She heard him pass behind her, felt the brief displacement of warm air, and then he was gone down the corridor toward his study door closed, the world reduced to the sound of his silence. Her housekeeper Martha appeared at the end of the hall with the expression she always wore when she'd witnessed something she didn't know how to address. "The linens for the guest rooms are pressed, ma'am," Martha said carefully. "Good." Eleanor finally turned from the flowers. "And the ice for the parlor. Coming up from the cellar now. Make sure the west parlor stays shaded until 5. It holds the heat worse than the east." Eleanor moved past her toward the kitchen staircase. "And Martha, if Mr. Graves asks for supper in his study again tonight, set it there without comment." Martha's mouth pressed into a line. "Yes, ma'am." "He won't ask, but if he does." She said it lightly. She'd learned to say most things lightly. The Aldridge party arrived not at 7, but at past, which was fashionable enough in Boston society to be considered a compliment rather than an insult. Captain James Aldridge came first through the door, shaking rain from his hat. A sudden summer shower had caught the carriages on Commonwealth, and he laughed about it. He laughed loudly, freely, without checking whether anyone in the room approved. Eleanor noticed that first. The laugh. She was standing near the fireplace with Mrs. Hargrove and 2 of the Pemberton sisters when the new arrivals came through, and she watched Nathaniel cross the room to receive them. The way he received everyone, hand-extended expression, composed voice, precisely calibrated to suggest both welcome and authority. He shook Aldridge's hand. "Nathaniel." Aldridge clapped him once on the shoulder, which almost no one did. "Fine house. Finer than I expected. You always did undersell everything you owned." Nathaniel said something she couldn't hear from across the room. His face didn't change. Aldridge laughed again. She turned back to Mrs. Hargrove and the conversation about the harbor shipping delays, and she did not think about the laugh again until it happened a second time closer and directed at her. "Mrs. Graves." Captain Aldridge had crossed the room with a confidence that wasn't arrogance, it was something more comfortable than that. He bowed correctly, but not stiffly. "James Aldridge, your husband and I were at Harvard together before I decided the sea suited me better than law. I'm afraid I don't have the patience for argument unless someone's shooting at me." The Pemberton sisters tittered. Mrs. Hargrove looked intrigued. Eleanor said, "I imagine the sea requires a different kind of argument entirely." "It does, ma'am. It argues back, which I find refreshing." He smiled a full, genuine smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. "Your husband spoke very little of you in his letters, which I have been told is either a sign of great privacy or great neglect. I suspect, given the room you've assembled here tonight, it's the former. A man who neglects his wife doesn't typically come home to flowers in the hallway." She paused. The wildflowers. She'd put them in the east corridor this morning without thinking, without intention, habit, just habit. They were convenient, she said. Most beautiful things are, until someone stops noticing them. He glanced briefly toward the far end of the room, where Nathaniel stood in close discussion with two of the merchantmen. Then Aldridge looked back at her, and his expression was easy, unhurried, like a man who had decided something without needing to announce it. "Would you do me the honor of telling me about this house, Mrs. Graves? I've heard it was built by your husband's grandfather. I'm a great admirer of men who build things that outlast them." She should have passed him to the housekeeper, or to one of the servants who gave the formal tours. She almost did. Then she thought about the study door, and the untouched dinner plate, and the 17 words this morning that had to last her through the day. "Of course," she said. "Follow me." She did not intend to be gone from the main reception more than 20 minutes. It was 45 before she realized it. Captain Aldridge asked real questions, not the polite surface-level inquiries men made when they were really thinking about something else. He asked about the mahogany bookshelves in the library and whether they'd come from the original construction. He asked who had chosen the portrait hanging above the landing, a painting of a woman Eleanor had never been told the name of, and when she admitted she didn't know, he said, "I'd want to know. A house should know its own history. Otherwise it's just walls." "Some would say walls are enough," Eleanor said. "Some would." He looked at her steadily. "Do you—" She didn't answer that. She moved toward the window at the end of the hall instead, and pointed out the view of the harbor, which was genuinely something, the last of the summer light, hitting the water copper and gold, the sail shapes in the distance. "There," she said. "That's the reason his grandfather built on this hill specifically. He wanted to see the harbor from every north-facing window." Aldridge came to stand beside her at the window. Not too close, just present. "What do you see when you look at it?" he asked. The question surprised her into honesty. "Space," she said. "A great deal of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a lonely answer, Mrs. Graves." "It's an accurate one." Another silence. And then he smiled, not the broad laugh from downstairs, but something quieter and more careful. "Well," he said, "you've been very generous with your time tonight. I won't presume on it further." He offered his arm to escort her back to the reception, and as they walked, he said conversationally, as if it were nothing, "For what it's worth, the room downstairs is better for your presence in it. Several people tracked the door waiting for you to return. I suspect most of them didn't know they were doing it." She didn't know what to say to that. She said nothing. But she noticed when they came back into the main parlor that she was standing straighter. Nathaniel noticed them come in. He noticed because he was speaking to Harrison Webb about the Charlestown mill contracts, and he lost the thread of the conversation, which was something that did not happen to Nathaniel Graves because he had trained himself against exactly that kind of failure. But there was a gap in his response, just a breath, just a half second, and Webb filled it himself without noticing. Eleanor was smiling at something Aldridge had said. Not her social smile, the careful, appropriate curve she wore at functions. Something else. Something he hadn't seen, and he could not immediately calculate how long. He found he didn't want to calculate it. "Graves," Webb said. 45% of the second hall. Nathaniel said without missing a beat. "Not 40. The margin doesn't hold otherwise." He did not look at his wife again for the remainder of the hour. He was deliberate about it. Supper was served in 2 sittings. The formal table for the principal guests, and a lighter arrangement in the side parlor for the overflow of the evening's attendees. Eleanor managed both without visible effort, directing the servants, speaking briefly to each table, making sure the wine was adequate, and the conversation didn't stall anywhere dangerous. She sat at the formal table between Mr. Webb and a shipping commissioner named Calloway. Nathaniel sat at the head. Captain Aldridge sat 3 seats down on the opposite side, and once during the meal he said something to the woman beside him that made the entire near end of the table laugh. Eleanor looked up. Aldridge was already looking at her. He raised his glass very slightly as if to say, "See, it's possible." She looked back down at her plate. Nathaniel at the head of the table said nothing. He was discussing railroad survey costs with Calloway, and he did not look up. But his fork, which had been moving, stopped. Just for a moment. Nobody saw it but Eleanor, who saw everything in that room, because watching things was how she survived them. After supper, the men went to Nathaniel's study for port and business, and the women gathered in the east parlor. Eleanor poured and smiled and listened and said appropriate things at appropriate moments. And by the time the carriages were called at 10:30, she had performed the evening so completely that even Martha, watching from the doorway, couldn't have said a word against it. The last carriage was the Aldridge party's. James Aldridge shook Nathaniel's hand again on the front steps and said something low, private that Eleanor didn't catch. Then he turned to her, bowed correctly over her hand, and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Graves, for the finest 45 minutes of the evening. I hope Boston treats you better than large houses sometimes do their occupants." "Safe travels, Captain Aldridge," she said. He smiled. Left. The night air sat on the empty steps between them, between Eleanor and Nathaniel, and for a moment neither of them moved. The summer heat had softened into something almost bearable. Somewhere below on the hill a carriage rolled away on cobblestone. Nathaniel said, "You showed him the house?" He asked. Yes. She did not turn to look at him. "Was that improper?" A pause. "No." "Then good night, Mr. Graves." She went inside. She heard him follow, heard his steps go left at the landing instead of right. Left toward his rooms, right toward hers. A geography they had established in the first silent weeks of their marriage without ever discussing it. She went right. She closed her door. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time and did not cry. She was done crying. She had decided that in February, around the time she stopped leaving his study light on when she went to bed, what she felt instead was something harder to name, something she wasn't sure she was permitted. What? Martha came in to help with her hair and found her still sitting in the dark. "Ma'am?" "The evening went well," Eleanor said. "It did. Everyone said so." "Good." She let Martha unpin her hair, the familiar pull and release of it. "Martha, when did you last see me laugh at something genuine?" Martha's hands paused, started again. "The McAllister children," she said after a moment. "When the younger one fell into the rosebush and came out perfectly fine and looking outraged. You laughed then." "That was March." "Yes, ma'am, March." Eleanor looked at her hands in her lap. "That's a long time." Martha said nothing. She was a woman who understood that some silences were not fulfilling. "He notices nothing," Eleanor said. Not with bitterness, just with the flatness of something she'd had a long time to consider. "I could put the house in order, or I could set the east parlor on fire, and I suspect the difference in his attention would be minimal. Mr. Graves is a busy man. All men with money are busy men. It's very convenient." She stood, moved toward the window. The harbor was black, and still below them just the faint light of ships at anchor. "Captain Aldridge asked me what I see when I look at the water." "Did he?" "I told him I see space. He said it was a lonely answer." She touched the glass lightly. "He wasn't wrong." Martha folded the evening gloves with a careful precision that meant she was choosing her words. "He seems a decent man. Direct. He is." Eleanor stepped back from the window. "Which makes him dangerous, I suppose. Decent men who pay attention to women who are not being attended to, that's a particular kind of dangerous." "Are you in danger, ma'am?" Eleanor considered it seriously because Martha had asked seriously. "No," she said at last. "But I think someone in this house might be, and it isn't me." She meant Nathaniel. She wasn't entirely sure why she meant him. Nathaniel did not go to bed. He went back to his study, and he sat in the chair by the window. Not the desk where he worked, but the chair where he thought, and he poured a glass of port he didn't drink. He was a man who prided himself on clarity. Clarity of purpose, clarity of mind, clarity of expectation. He had married Eleanor Whitmore because the match made sense. Her family name carried weight even after her father's debts had stripped its fortune, and he had fortune that needed the kind of social anchoring that came with lineage. He had been honest about that. He had not pretended it was more. He had given her a house security staff, social position, everything a woman in her situation should have needed. He had not given her his attention. He acknowledged that now, sitting in the chair, hearing the echo of Aldridge's laugh across a dinner table. He had not given her his attention because attention was a thing he rationed carefully, and because if he was being completely honest, which he was in the dark with the port, he wasn't drinking. He had not wanted to get into the habit of looking at her. He was not sure when that decision had been made. Somewhere in the first weeks, he thought. She'd been so careful, so composed. She'd moved through his house like she was trying not to disturb it, and he'd thought he'd told himself that it was exactly what he wanted. A quiet marriage. An orderly life. No entanglements. He'd looked at her tonight walking back into that parlor with James Aldridge, and he'd thought she is not trying not to disturb anything. She is trying not to be seen, and Aldridge had seen her. Nathaniel set down the glass, stood, walked to the window and looked at the harbor, which was what he always did when he needed to think past the edges of what he was willing to think about. The water told him nothing useful. It never did. He just kept looking at it because it was better than looking at the other window, the one across the house where a light had burned late into the evening every night for the first 4 months of his marriage. He had noticed when it stopped. He had not done anything about it. He had told himself that was the right choice. He was beginning to think it had been a coward's choice dressed up in the language of clarity. The summer night pressed against the glass. Somewhere in this house, his wife sat in the dark and did not laugh, and had not laughed since March, and he had not known that he would not have known it if Martha hadn't said across the supper table earlier, laughing herself at something the Pemberton woman said. The last time I heard a real laugh in this house was March. Lord, was it? March. And Eleanor had said nothing. Just looked at her wine glass, and Nathaniel had filed it away under unimportant and continued his conversation about railroad surveys. He picked up the port, drank it. March was 4 months ago. He was a man who prided himself on clarity, and the clear truth was this: his wife had not laughed in 4 months, and it had taken a man from somewhere else to look at her long enough to see it. He set the glass down. He did not sleep for a long time. The next morning, Eleanor came down early. She always came down early and found the dining room set for 2. It was always set for 2. Nathaniel ate in his study more mornings than not, and the second place sat there like a small daily reminder of something she had given up expecting. She sat down, poured her coffee, opened the letter from her cousin in Portsmouth that had arrived yesterday, and she hadn't had time to read. She heard boot steps on the stairs. Different timing than usual. Faster. Nathaniel came into the dining room and stopped briefly at the sight of her, stopped in a way he didn't usually stop, like he'd expected something, and found something else. Then he crossed to the table and sat down. In his place. At the table. Eleanor kept her eyes on the letter. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." Martha appeared in the doorway, saw Nathaniel at the table, and vanished back to the kitchen with the expression of a woman recalculating several things simultaneously. Nathaniel poured his own coffee. He looked at the letter in her hands. From my cousin Charlotte, in Portsmouth. Is she well? She says so. A silence. She turned the page. He drank his coffee and looked at the window over her shoulder. Outside, the summer morning was already bright and loud with birds, and the harbor shimmered far below. The evening was successful, he said finally. You managed it well. She put the letter down and looked at him directly. She could do that now, could look at him without it costing her anything, because she had made peace with not being seen, and a woman who has made peace with something is harder to unsettle than a woman still hoping. "Thank you," she said. He met her eyes. There was something in his that she couldn't identify, not quite discomfort, not quite the sealed-off composure he usually wore. Something slightly unfinished. "Aldridge is a good man," he said. "We were close at Harvard. Before I became who I became." He said it simply, without apology or irony. "He's the kind of man who notices things." She waited. "He mentioned," Nathaniel said carefully, "that the house was better for your presence in it." She picked up her coffee cup. "He said something similar to me. And I told him the flowers were convenient." She took a sip, set it down. "He didn't believe me. He's perceptive that way." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she almost didn't catch almost. It was gone before she could name it. "He'll be in Boston until September," Nathaniel said. "His party is invited to the Hargrove dinner on Thursday." "I know," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove's note mentioned it." "Yes." He set his cup down. "I'll be attending." She looked at him again. In the 14 months of their marriage, Nathaniel Graves had attended 4 social functions that were not directly connected to business. She knew the count exactly. "All right," she said. He nodded, stood, straightened his coat. Then at the door he paused, turned back. She was watching him. She always watched him. It was the habit of a woman who had learned that the only warning she ever got was in the margins of things, the half-second hesitations, the almost spoken words. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. He looked at her for a beat too long, a beat that had something in it she couldn't read yet, something just beginning to take a shape she didn't have a name for. "The wildflowers," he said, "in the corridor." "Yes?" "Leave them." He left. She sat with her coffee and her cousin's letter and the morning birds, and she thought about that, leave them, and what it meant from a man who had never once remarked on anything she'd placed in his house. She thought about James Aldridge's voice saying most beautiful things are convenient until someone stops noticing them. She thought about Nathaniel's face at the door and the unfinished thing in it. She did not let herself think what she wanted to think. She had learned over 14 months not to build structures on insufficient foundations. But she left the wildflowers, and she noticed when she walked through the East Corridor that afternoon that someone, not Martha, not any of the staff she'd asked, had replaced the ones that were wilting with fresh ones. Blue and gold. She stood there for a long moment. Then she walked on. Behind her, from the direction of the study, she heard nothing, but the door, which was usually shut, was open 3 inches. Just 3 inches. Like a man testing how much air a room needed to breathe. She didn't look back, but she felt it. The 3 inches, like the first crack in something that had been solid for a very long time. She wasn't sure yet whether it would hold or give. But she was, for the first time in 4 months, not entirely certain she wanted it to hold. The Thursday dinner at the Hargrove estate was the kind of event Boston society treated like a referendum. Who attended told you something. Who sat where told you more, and who spoke to whom across a room full of people carefully pretending they weren't watching that told you everything. Eleanor knew this. She had known it since she was 12 years old, and her mother had made her memorize the seating arrangements at her aunt's Christmas supper like a military strategy. Know the room before the room knows you. It was the only inheritance her mother had left her that hadn't been touched by her father's debts. She wore the blue silk. She hadn't worn it since the previous autumn. It was the color of deep water, the kind that made people look twice without quite knowing why and when. Martha fastened the last button at her back and stepped away. She looked at herself in the glass for a long moment. "You look like yourself tonight," Martha said. Eleanor said, "I look like myself every night." "No, ma'am." Martha's voice was gentle but direct. "Most nights you look like Mrs. Graves. Tonight you look like you." She didn't have an answer to that. She picked up her gloves and went downstairs. Nathaniel was waiting in the front hall. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well. It was one of the things you couldn't fault him for. and he looked up when she came down the stairs. His eyes moved over her once quickly, then returned to her face, and something in his expression shifted by a fraction of a degree that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 14 months learning to read him. He said nothing about the dress. He offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked out to the carriage together, the way they always did, correctly, composedly, like two people who had agreed on the shape of their life without ever discussing the contents of it. The ride to the Hargrove estate took 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, Nathaniel said 4 things that the weather was holding, that Harrison Webb would likely bring up the mill survey again tonight, that the Hargrove boy had apparently returned from Philadelphia with a new business partner nobody had vetted properly, and that Eleanor should feel free to retire early if the evening ran long. She said 3 things that she'd heard about the weather, that she would speak to Webb if Nathaniel needed a natural break from the conversation, and that she didn't tire easily. On the last one, she felt him glance at her. She kept her face toward the window. They arrived. The door opened. The night took them in. And across the crowded entrance hall, James Aldridge saw her from 20 feet away, and smiled like a man who had been waiting for something good to happen and was pleasantly unsurprised that it had. She smiled back. She couldn't help it. It was reflexive, unguarded, the kind of smile that happens before the careful part of you catches up with the honest part. She felt it on her face and couldn't entirely regret it. Beside her, Nathaniel's arm tightened almost imperceptibly under her hand. Almost. She noticed. She said nothing and walked forward to greet their hostess. Mrs. Hargrove was a woman of 60 who had outlasted 2 husbands, 3 business reversals, and the better part of Boston society's attempts to define her, and she received Eleanor with the particular warmth she reserved for women she respected. "Mrs. Graves, you wore the blue. I told Thomas last week if Eleanor Graves ever wears the blue to one of my dinners, I'll consider the evening already a success." She pressed Eleanor's hands and leaned close. "Nathaniel's mother arrives tomorrow, by the by. Thought you'd want a day's warning." Eleanor kept her expression perfectly even. "Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove. That's very thoughtful. She wrote to me herself. Apparently she's decided Boston needs her attention." Mrs. Hargrove's eyes sparkled. "Which means she's decided you need her attention. God give you strength, dear." Nathaniel, 3 feet away speaking to his host, had not heard this. Eleanor was reasonably certain of that because his posture didn't change. She was less certain of everything else. Catherine Graves. Coming to Boston. Tomorrow. She folded that information somewhere quiet in her chest and smiled at the next person who approached her. And the smile was genuine because she had long since decided that the only power available to her in most situations was the power to remain composed while the world arranged itself against her. She was very, very good at remaining composed. James Aldridge reached her 20 minutes into the evening when Nathaniel was across the room with 3 merchants and 2 glasses of wine, deep into something about tariff legislation. "Mrs. Graves." He bowed over her hand. "The blue suits you. Several people have said so tonight. Several people noticed. There's a difference." He straightened and stood beside her, looking out at the room with the easy comfort of a man who had navigated too many foreign ports to be intimidated by a Boston parlor. "How are you this evening, genuinely?" "Genuinely." She considered it. Forewarned. "About—" "My mother-in-law arrives tomorrow." Aldridge was quiet for one beat. Then, "Ah. You know her. I've met Mrs. Catherine Graves once, at Harvard when she came to collect Nathaniel after his father died. She walked into the administration hall, spoke to 3 professors, and the dean in under 10 minutes reorganized Nathaniel's academic schedule and left." He paused. "She terrified everyone present. I found her magnificent." Eleanor looked at him. Magnificent. A woman who walks into a room and immediately understands its entire architecture, social, political, personal, and acts on that understanding without hesitation. He raised his glass slightly. "That's a kind of genius, even if it's uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of it." "I've been on the receiving end of her letters for 14 months, Eleanor said. "I can confirm it's uncomfortable." He laughed, and again, it was that full laugh, the one that didn't ask the room's permission, And Eleanor felt it happen again, that reflexive, unguarded response. She caught it faster this time, controlled it. But it had been there. She became aware suddenly that she was being watched. Not by Aldridge. By someone closer at an angle she'd registered without looking directly at. She turned her head slightly. Nathaniel was still across the room, but he was no longer looking at Harrison Webb. He was looking at her, not with the sealed-off expression he usually wore in public, with something rawer and less practiced, something he hadn't bothered to compose because he hadn't expected to need to and hadn't caught himself in time. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. He looked away first. She turned back to Aldridge and said, "Tell me about your ships." And the conversation moved, and she kept her voice steady, and she thought about nothing except the 2 seconds and what had lived in them. Dinner was seated in the formal arrangement that Mrs. Hargrove favored: long table, strict alternation of genders, no couples adjacent. Eleanor sat between a judge named Calloway and a young man she didn't know who turned out to be the Hargrove boys' mysterious Philadelphia business partner. A Mr. Elias Penn, sharp-eyed and quietly ambitious in the way of men who had built something themselves rather than inherited it. Aldridge was 6 seats down. Nathaniel was at the far end between 2 women whose names Eleanor knew and whose opinions of her she also knew, which was mildly entertaining in the way that most unpleasant things eventually became entertaining once you stopped needing people to be kind to you. She spoke to Calloway about the harbor expansion project because she actually knew something about it. Her father had been in shipping before, and she had listened at his table every night for 18 years before that table was sold to pay his creditors. She spoke to Penn about Philadelphia because she'd been there twice as a girl and remembered it as a city that moved faster than it thought. He looked surprised that she had opinions. She was used to that. Somewhere around the 3rd course, she heard Nathaniel's voice rise briefly above the general conversation. He was telling a story. She recognized the cadence, the particular rhythm he used when he was performing competence for an audience, and the women beside him laughed appreciatively, and she thought, he can do it. He knows how. He just doesn't bother. She looked down at her plate. Penn said, "You went quiet." She looked up. He was watching her with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to perform indifference. "Did I? I'm sorry." "Don't be. I went quiet at the exact same moment for the exact same reason." He said it without inflection, without cruelty, simply as an observation. "It's a particular kind of loud, isn't it? The sound of someone being charming at you from a distance." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "Mr. Penn, I think you may be more perceptive than your business partner gave me reason to expect." "His standards for perceptiveness are different from mine," Penn said mildly. "He wants partners who see opportunity. I prefer people who see things." "And what do you see tonight?" He picked up his wine. "A woman who is the most capable person at this table being looked at by the 2 most interesting men in the room for completely different reasons." He took a sip. "And a husband who has just realized about 3 courses too late that he is one of them." She said nothing. Penn set his glass down. "Forgive me. I'm told I speak plainly at unsuitable moments." "Don't apologize," she said quietly. "I find it refreshing." She didn't look toward Nathaniel's end of the table, but she felt it, the directional weight of someone's attention, the same way you feel a change in temperature before you see its cause. Dinner ended. The company moved to the parlors. Eleanor navigated the transition with the practiced ease of a woman who had run her husband's household for 14 months without once being asked if she needed help, and she was halfway through a conversation with Mrs. Pemberton about the Ladies' Society quarterly collection when she heard the voice behind her. Not Aldridge's voice, not Penn's. Nathaniel's. "Excuse me." He said it to Mrs. Pemberton politely, but with finality, the tone of a man who was accustomed to the world rearranging itself when he used that voice. Mrs. Pemberton excused herself with the speed of a woman who understood power differentials. Then Nathaniel was beside Eleanor, close enough that his arm nearly touched hers, and he said low and quiet for her ears only, "You didn't eat much at dinner." She blinked, of all the things she had expected him to say. "I ate adequately." "You ate the fish and the bread. You didn't touch the 3rd course." She stared at him. "You were watching what I ate." I was... He stopped, recalibrated. I notice things. You notice very selective things, Mr. Graves. She kept her voice low to match his, because they were in a room full of people, and she was not going to give Boston society the satisfaction of witnessing whatever this was. This is the first time in 14 months you've commented on my meals. His jaw tightened slightly. Eleanor, I'm not angry, she said, and the terrible thing was that it was mostly true. She wasn't angry. She was something more complicated and less useful than anger. I'm simply accurate. If you've developed an interest in whether I eat properly, that's new information, and I'd like to know what to do with it. He was quiet for a moment. Someone across the room laughed loudly. Aldridge, she recognized it, and she saw Nathaniel's gaze flick in that direction and come back. Pen, he said. At dinner. What did you talk to him about? She looked at him, really looked at him. Philadelphia, she said. And what it means to see things. And Aldridge before dinner. Ships, and your mother. She watched his face. She arrives tomorrow. I assume you knew. Something crossed his expression, not surprise, but a different kind of adjustment. She wrote to me this morning. And you didn't tell me. I was going to. When? She said it without heat. Just plainly the way Penn had said things plainly, and it landed with the same quiet weight. Before she arrived or after, he didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. She looked out at the room, at the comfortable, ordered social world they both moved through with such practiced ease, and she said, I've managed your household for 14 months without a complaint. I will manage your mother's visit the same way. But I'd appreciate the information I need to do it, and I'd appreciate it in advance. She turned back to him. That's all. That's not an accusation, it's a request. He looked at her. In the noise and light of the Hargrove parlor with 30 people moving around them, and Aldridge's laugh cutting through the room again. Nathaniel Graves looked at his wife like he was reading something in a language he'd thought he knew and had just discovered he'd been translating wrong. All right, he said. Thank you. She moved away. She didn't rush it. She moved at a natural pace toward Mrs. Hargrove, who needed her for something involving the dessert arrangement, and she breathed steadily, and she did not let her hands shake, and she counted the steps. The way she used to count things when she was small, and the world was loud, and her father's voice was raised, and the only thing you could control was your own footfall. 1, 2, 3. She reached Mrs. Hargrove and was immediately absorbed into a perfectly ordinary conversation about sugar cake. And she was fine. She was completely, absolutely fine. It was Nathaniel who stood where she'd left him for a moment too long in the middle of the Hargrove parlor, looking at the space she'd walked away from before James Aldridge appeared at his elbow with a glass of port and said quietly, You look like a man who's just realized he's been standing outside his own house without a key. Nathaniel said nothing. Aldridge said, I'm not your enemy, Nathaniel. I want you to know that. I know that. But I will tell you what I told you at Harvard when you were deciding whether to take over your father's business or read law. Aldridge's voice was easy without judgment. You have a talent for knowing what you want, long after the moment when wanting it would have cost you nothing. You wait until it costs you something, and then you call it clarity. He took a sip of his port. It's not clarity, it's fear. Nathaniel said, I don't remember you being this direct at Harvard. I wasn't. You weren't ready to hear it. Aldridge looked across the room at Eleanor, who was laughing genuinely, laughing the real laugh, the one that started in her whole face at something Mrs. Hargrove had said. I wonder if you're ready now. She's my wife, Nathaniel said, and it came out with an edge that surprised even him. Aldridge raised an eyebrow. Yes, he said. She is. He walked away. Nathaniel picked up a glass from a passing tray, looked at it, and put it down again without drinking. Across the room, Eleanor was still laughing. Mrs. Hargrove was telling a story with her hands wide and expressive, and Eleanor's laugh was full and bright and completely unaware that anyone was watching it, because no one had watched it in long enough that she'd stopped accounting for the possibility. That laugh. He had never heard that laugh. He was certain of it. In 14 months of the same house, the same dining room, the same corridors and mornings and social performances, he had never heard that specific sound. He had not been listening for it. The realization settled in him like weight. Not guilt, not yet something earlier than guilt, the moment before you name the thing you've done, when it's still just a shape without a word. He had not been listening. The evening ended at 10:30. The carriages came. Eleanor said her goodbyes with grace and warmth, and the particular skill she had for making each person feel they'd been genuinely seen, which Nathaniel noticed with new eyes. Now noticed that she did it, that it was real rather than performed. That the women pressed her hands and the men bowed more than protocol required. She collected his arm at the door as naturally as breathing. He was aware of the exact weight of her hand on his sleeve. In the carriage, she was quiet. Not the tight quiet of unhappiness, but the comfortable quiet of someone who'd had a full evening and didn't need to debrief it. She looked at her hands. Outside, Boston moved past dark and summer warm. He said, "My mother will stay in the East Wing. I'll have it prepared tomorrow morning. She'll want to speak to you privately. She always does." "I know." "She can be—" He paused. "Particular." "Yes." Eleanor's voice was dry but not unkind. "I've been corresponding with her for over a year. I have a reasonable understanding of her particularness. She wrote things. She wrote her opinions. She has strong ones." He shifted slightly. "Whatever she said in those letters." "Nathaniel." She said his name with a patience that was somehow worse than sharpness. "I don't need you to apologize for things your mother wrote. I need you to be present when she's in the house, because if she has concerns about how I run it, I'd prefer to address them with you there, rather than have the conversation edited afterward. She doesn't— It's not the household I know what she questions." Her voice was steady as still water. "She questions whether I'm sufficient for this marriage. Whether I'm capable enough, visible enough, grateful enough for the position I've been placed in." She looked at him then, direct and clear. "She wrote it very elegantly in the February letter. I was impressed by the phrasing, actually." He stared at her. "You never said anything." "No." She looked back at her hands. "I didn't." "Why?" The question hung. She took a breath, not a shaking one, a measured one, the kind she used when she was deciding exactly how much truth the moment could hold. Because at the time, she said, "I wasn't entirely sure she was wrong." The carriage hit a rut in the road. The gas lamps flickered past the window. Nathaniel sat with that sentence, which had the weight of something that had been carried a long time and was only now being set down. He said, "She was wrong." Eleanor looked at him again. His voice had been certain, not loud, not defensive, just certain. The voice of a man who had just decided something and was stating the result. "Was she?" Eleanor said. "Yes." She searched his face. He let her. He didn't arrange it into the composed mask he usually wore. He left it the way it was, which was something closer to unguarded than she'd seen from him since before the wedding. "That's—" She stopped, started again. "That's a significant thing to say." "I know. It doesn't undo 14 months. No. Then why say it now?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the city gave way to the quieter streets of Beacon Hill, the familiar slope of the road toward home. "Because he said, 'I watched you laugh tonight and I didn't know the sound,' and that is—" He paused again. She had the sense he was doing something unusual for him, which was speaking before he'd finished composing what he meant to say. "That is not the state of affairs I intended. When I didn't intend indifference. I want to be clear about that." "What did you intend?" "Order," he said, and the word came out smaller than he'd probably planned. "I intended order. I'm not good at I don't—" He stopped. His hands, she noticed, were still. He was a man who controlled his body very well, always, but the stillness had the quality of effort rather than ease. "I don't manage the unpredictable parts well. Of people. Of relationships. I manage what I understand, and I arranged our marriage in a way I understood." She let that settle. Then, "And I was the part you didn't understand." "You were the part I was afraid to try to understand," he said, "because I was not confident I would succeed at it, and I don't. I handle failure poorly." The carriage stopped. They were home. The driver opened the door, and the night air came in warm and heavy with summer. Neither of them moved immediately. Eleanor said quietly, "That might be the most honest thing you've said to me since our wedding." He said, "I know. I'm sorry it took so long." She stepped out of the carriage. He followed. They walked up the front steps in silence, and Martha opened the door, and the house took them in with its familiar smells of candle wax and wood and the faint trace of wildflowers from the east corridor. Eleanor stopped in the hall. "Good night, Nathaniel." "Good night." She went up the stairs. He stayed below, one hand on the newel post, watching her go. She did not turn around. She reached the landing, turned right toward her rooms, and stopped. The study door was open again. More than 3 inches this time. A foot, maybe. The lamp inside still burning. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the wall. Then she said, without turning around, knowing he was below and could not hear her, "Your mother is going to be a problem." She said it to herself, really. Or maybe to the house. To the 14 months of silence that had lived in it. Then she went to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and this time, when she thought about the evening, about Aldridge's laugh and Penn's plain words, and the carriage ride, and "I was afraid to try to understand you," she didn't feel the flat, settled weight she'd been carrying since February. She felt something alert and wary and dangerous, like standing at the edge of something without knowing yet whether it was a beginning or a drop. Tomorrow, Catherine Graves would arrive, and nothing in this house would be the same after. She knew it the way you know weather before it hits in your bones, in the back of your throat, in the particular quality of a silence that isn't empty anymore. She blew out the lamp. In the dark, she thought, "I need to be ready." She was already starting to think about what ready meant. Catherine Graves arrived at 9:30 in the morning, which meant she had left Providence before dawn, which meant she had not wanted to give anyone time to prepare. Eleanor had been ready since 7. She was standing at the front hall when the carriage came up the drive, not waiting at the door, like a woman bracing for an inspection, but moving through the hall with purpose, checking that the east wing was properly aired, that the breakfast things had been cleared, that the arrangement of cut flowers on the entrance table was impeccable. She heard the carriage, and she finished what she was doing before she walked to the door. 2 full minutes, deliberately. Martha appeared at her elbow. "She's early." "She's on time," Eleanor said. She always intended to arrive at 9:30. The letter said noon to give us the impression of a delay that hadn't happened. Martha stared at her. "You knew." "I guessed." Eleanor smoothed the front of her dress. "Open the door, please." Catherine Graves was 61 years old and moved like a woman of 40 who had decided that aging was an inconvenience she was too busy to accommodate. She came through the front door with her travel coat still on her eyes, moving across the hall the way a general surveys terrain, taking inventory, measuring distance, identifying the high ground. Those eyes landed on Eleanor. "Mrs. Graves," Catherine said. "Mrs. Graves," Eleanor replied. The two of them stood there for a moment, measuring each other with the particular precision of women who had been exchanging letters for 14 months and were now finally putting faces to the words. Catherine took off her gloves. "The hall looks better than I expected. You changed the mirror." "I moved it 18 inches to the left. The light was wrong where it was." "My husband put it there." "I know. The light was still wrong." A pause. Something moved through Catherine's expression. Not anger. Not quite. Something more like recalibration. She handed her gloves to the waiting footman and said, "Coffee, please. Strong. And I'll take it in the morning room." "Of course." Eleanor gestured toward the corridor. "Right this way." She led her mother-in-law through the house she had run for 14 months, and she did not apologize for any of it, and she did not explain any of it, and she did not perform any of the gentle deference she had spent 2 weeks mentally rehearsing and then decided against. If Catherine Graves wanted to judge the house, she could judge it. Eleanor had nothing to hide in it. They reached the morning room. Coffee came. Catherine sat and poured without being invited to, which was a power move, so natural it had clearly stopped being conscious decades ago. And Eleanor sat across from her and accepted the cup that was handed to her and waited. "Where is my son?" Catherine said. "His office on State Street. He expected you at noon." "He should have expected me earlier." She took a sip. "He knows me. He does. But he also knows that anticipating you completely would deprive you of the advantage, and he's too smart to do that." Catherine set down her cup. For the first time since she'd walked through the door, she was fully still, looking at Eleanor with an attention that was almost physical in its weight. "That's the most interesting thing you've said to me in 14 months of letters," she said. "Most of what I wrote in those letters," Eleanor said, "was careful." "I know. I was waiting for you to stop being careful. And now you have competition." Catherine's voice was perfectly level. "Which has a remarkable effect on women who've been sleepwalking." Eleanor did not flinch. She held the woman's gaze and said very quietly, "I haven't been sleepwalking." "No, you've been surviving. There's a difference, and I'll grant you that distinction." Catherine refilled her own cup. "Captain Aldridge, tell me about him. He's your son's Harvard friend. You've met him." "I've met him. I want to know what you think of him." Eleanor considered the question. Not its answer, she knew the answer, but the question itself, and what it was actually asking, and what the correct amount of truth was. She had spent 14 months calculating correct amounts of truth, and she was tired of it. "I think he's a decent man," she said, "who pays attention to things that matter and doesn't require social permission to act on what he notices. I find that quality rare enough to appreciate." "Including noticing you?" "Yes, including that." Catherine nodded slowly. "Does Nathaniel know how you feel?" "I've been transparent with my husband about Captain Aldridge. There is nothing to conceal." "I didn't ask about concealment. I asked about feeling." Catherine leaned forward slightly. "Eleanor, I have been writing to you for 14 months, trying to determine whether you are a woman capable of holding what I built. Not the house. Not the social position. What I actually built, which is a family that has survived 3 generations of men who were too proud for their own good." She paused. "I need to know if you're afraid of my son." The question cracked the air between them. Eleanor felt it land somewhere central, somewhere she'd been protecting. "No," she said. "Then why have you let him ignore you for a year without saying a word about it in any letter to me or to anyone, as far as I can determine?" "Because saying a word would have meant admitting I needed someone to intervene, and I don't." "That's pride." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is. Would you have preferred a daughter-in-law without it?" The silence stretched out. Outside, a carriage passed on the street. Somewhere in the house, Martha's footsteps moved across the kitchen floor. Catherine Graves looked at Eleanor Whitmore Graves for a long moment, and then she did something Eleanor had not once anticipated. She smiled. Not broadly, not warmly, but genuinely. "No," she said. "God help me, I wouldn't have." She sat back. "All right. We understand each other better than our letters suggested." "Good." The smile faded into something more serious. "Now I'm going to tell you something about my son that he will not tell you himself. And I'm telling you because I need you to understand what you're dealing with." Eleanor waited. "His father," Catherine said, "was a man who built everything from discipline. The business, the reputation, the family name, all of it constructed on the premise that feelings were a liability. He said it outright. I heard it 100 times. Sentiment is what poor men use to explain their failures. He said it to Nathaniel when he was 8 years old." She paused. "And Nathaniel because he was brilliant, and because he loved his father, and because children learn what they live, believed him. Has believed him ever since." She looked at her hands on the table. "His father was not a bad man, but he did considerable damage under the belief that damage and discipline were the same thing." Eleanor heard the words land one by one, each with its own weight. "I didn't know," she said. "Nathaniel doesn't talk about it. He never has." Catherine looked up. He chose you, Eleanor. I want to be precise about that. He could have chosen among a dozen women better positioned than a bankrupt merchant's daughter, and he chose you. Do you know why? She shook her head. He told me, Catherine said, that you were the only woman he'd spoken to in 2 years who hadn't tried to manage him, who had simply talked to him as though he were a person rather than a prize. She paused. He didn't know what to do with that, so he did what my husband taught him. He built structure around it and called the structure a marriage. Eleanor was very still. He built a cage, she said quietly. He built a container, Catherine corrected. He doesn't know the difference yet. She picked up her coffee. That is what I came to address, because I also received a letter not from you that suggested the container may be developing a crack. From whom? Mrs. Hargrove. Catherine's voice was dry. She wrote that Nathaniel looked at you across the Hargrove parlor last Thursday, as though he was seeing you for the first time. And that James Aldridge looked at you the way a man looks at something he recognizes and respects. And that the combination of those two things had apparently done more for the state of your marriage in one evening than 14 months of careful cohabitation. She set the cup down. Mrs. Hargrove is 70 years old and has seen more marriages made and broken than most people have had hot dinners. I take her observations seriously. Eleanor didn't know whether to feel exposed or relieved. She chose something in between. What are you asking me to do? I'm not asking you to do anything. Catherine stood smoothing her dress in a gesture so like Nathaniel's habit of adjusting his coat that Eleanor nearly startled. I'm telling you that my son is standing on the edge of learning something important about himself, and that it will either make him a man worth having or retreat him into everything his father made him, and that the deciding factor is whether you can hold your ground when he pushes back. And he'll push back. He always does, when he's afraid. He said as much, in the carriage after the Hargrove dinner. Catherine stopped moving. He told you he was afraid. He said he was afraid to try to understand me in case he failed at it. Silence. A different quality of silence than before. Eleanor, Catherine said, my son has never admitted fear to a living person, not once in 34 years. She was looking at her with an expression that was the first truly unguarded thing Eleanor had seen from her. Not to me? Not to anyone. Eleanor held the information carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you haven't yet decided what to do with. I didn't know that was unusual. It's not unusual, it's unprecedented. Catherine picked up her gloves from the side table. Well, she cleared her throat. I have unpacking to see to, and I expect Nathaniel will arrive by noon in a state of controlled concern that he will express as calmness. I'd like to be ready for that. She moved toward the door and paused at it, one hand on the frame. You moved the mirror. Yes. The light is better where you put it. She walked out. Eleanor sat with her coffee and the morning, and the entirely revised map of her marriage, and she thought about an 8-year-old boy being told that sentiment was for poor men. And she thought about 14 months of silence and study doors and careful, correct distance. And she thought, oh, just that. Oh. Nathaniel arrived at noon exactly. He walked in to find his mother in the library, and his wife arranging the books she'd moved to make room for Catherine's personal volumes, which had arrived ahead of her in a trunk, and the two women were not speaking, but were operating in the same space, with an ease that he had not expected and that stopped him in the doorway. Mother, he said. You're on time, Catherine said without looking up from the letter she was reading. Surprising. I said noon. It's noon. He looked at Eleanor, who looked back at him steadily over the books. Everything is settled. The East Wing. Ready since this morning, Eleanor said. Your mother's books arrived at 11. She wants the larger writing desk moved to face the window. I'll have it done. It's already done. He stood there. Right. Catherine finally looked up. Sit down, Nathaniel. You're hovering. He sat. This was the particular dynamic Eleanor had glimpsed in letters and now saw live in Catherine Graves's presence. Nathaniel became something slightly more human and slightly less armored, like a man who'd learned his discipline from a source who could also at will remove it. "Captain Aldridge called this morning," Catherine said conversationally. Nathaniel's attention sharpened. "He called here. He left a card. He's invited your wife to join his party for the Botanical Society excursion on Saturday. Apparently it was Mrs. Pemberton's suggestion." Catherine's tone was perfectly neutral. "He very properly addressed the invitation to both of you, but I imagine he's aware that you have the warehouse survey this weekend." Eleanor watched Nathaniel process this. She could see the moment he decided on his response, which was careful and controlled, and she could see beneath it the thing that the response was containing. "I can adjust the survey," he said. Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Can you?" "Yes. You've been scheduling that survey for 6 weeks. The survey can wait a week." He said it firmly. "If the excursion is Saturday, I'll be available." Eleanor set down the book she was holding. "Nathaniel," he looked at her, "you don't have to rearrange the survey." "I want to attend." "The invitation was for both of us. If you have prior commitments." "I don't have commitments that outrank my wife's social engagements." He said it with a directness that hit the room. "I should have understood that some time ago. I understand it now." Catherine went back to her letter with the expression of a woman deliberately not commenting. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel and saw the effort in him, the particular effort of a man doing something that doesn't come naturally because he has decided it's necessary, which is a different thing from ease, but not a lesser one. "All right," she said. "Saturday." "Saturday," he agreed. He stayed in the library for another hour talking to his mother about business that Eleanor mostly tuned out, and she continued with the books, and she was aware of him in the room, the way she'd always been aware of him, with the full peripheral attention of someone who'd learned to track a weather system. But it was different now. The thing tracking was different. James Aldridge arrived in the late afternoon. He had not sent a card ahead this time. Eleanor was in the side garden when she heard his voice at the front door, and she came around the corner of the house to find him and Nathaniel on the front steps in a conversation that looked easy on the surface and had something considerably less easy underneath it. "Only a suggestion, Nat. It was Mrs. Pemberton's idea, as I said." "I know whose idea it was." Nathaniel's voice was measured. "I'm not objecting to the excursion. You're objecting to something." He saw Eleanor. Both men turned. Aldridge smiled. Nathaniel's expression did what it now did more frequently around her, became something slightly more open than his default. "Captain Aldridge," Eleanor said. "I wasn't expecting you. I apologize for the lack of warning. I was passing, and well passing is a relative term. I made a deliberate detour." He grinned at his own honesty. "I wanted to ensure the Saturday invitation wasn't an inconvenience." "It isn't. Nathaniel has adjusted his schedule to attend." Aldridge glanced at Nathaniel. Something crossed his face. Pleasure, she thought, and something warmer than surprise. "Has he?" "The survey can wait," Nathaniel said in a tone that closed the discussion. Aldridge nodded. Once. Then, "Good." He looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Graves, your mother-in-law, is in residence, I understand." "She arrived this morning." "Is she receiving?" "I'd like to pay my respects before dinner commitments take me." Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. He shrugged, the first genuinely unguarded physical gesture she'd seen from him in company. "She'll be in the library. She's always in the library." They went in. All three of them. Catherine looked up from her writing desk, now facing the window when they came into the library. She looked at Aldridge. He looked at her. A recognition passed between them that was partly social and partly the mutual assessment of two people who have each independently decided they understand the world and are now encountering someone else who makes the same claim. "Captain Aldridge," Catherine said. "Mrs. Graves." He bowed. "You're exactly as I remembered." "Impossible. I'm 20 years older than when you last saw me." "Yes. And you moved the furniture to face the window, which is exactly what I would have expected." He sat without being invited, which was apparently the correct move, because Catherine's expression approved of it. "You've had an interesting morning." Every morning is interesting if you approach it correctly. Catherine looked at Eleanor briefly, then back at Aldridge. You've been spending time with my daughter-in-law. I have. She's remarkable company. She is. My son took some time to notice that. Mother, Nathaniel said. It's accurate, Catherine said without heat. I'm not being unkind. I'm being factual. She looked at Aldridge. You noticed. Immediately. He said it without apology, without subtext, as simple fact. She's the kind of person you notice immediately if you're paying attention. The question is, why more people in this house weren't paying attention? The silence was sudden and pointed. Nathaniel stood very still by the window. Eleanor kept her face neutral. Catherine looked at Aldridge with the focused attention of a woman hearing the answer to a question she'd asked carefully. You're fond of her, Catherine said. I respect her, Aldridge said. There's a version of fond that isn't complicated, and a version that is. I prefer the uncomplicated version. He glanced at Nathaniel. Which is why I want to be clear to everyone in this room that my interest in Mrs. Graves is of the uncomplicated kind. She deserves people who see her. I can be one of those people without requiring anything in return. Nathaniel said, That's a very precise statement. I'm a precise man when precision matters. Aldridge met his eyes. You're my friend, Nathaniel. You've been my friend since we were 19 years old, and you lent me your lecture notes when I missed 3 weeks of term with fever. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here because I came to Boston and found that your wife has been sitting in a beautiful house being treated like a piece of furniture that matches the wallpaper, and it offended me. He paused. As a friend, I'm telling you that. As a friend. The room held its breath. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. She looked back. She didn't help him. She didn't rescue the moment or soften it or look away. She let him sit in it because it was true, and he needed to sit in true things. I know, Nathaniel said. Good. Aldridge stood. Then we understand each other. He bowed to Catherine. Mrs. Graves, a pleasure as always. He looked at Eleanor. Saturday, 10 o'clock. The Pemberton carriage will collect from here. We'll be ready, Eleanor said. He left. The 3 remaining Graves, 2 by blood, 1 by law, stood in the library in the late afternoon light, and the air had the quality of something recently lanced, which is to say, it hurt, but it also finally breathed. Catherine said, I like him. I know, Nathaniel said. He said what needed to be said. I know that too. Catherine looked at her son for a long moment. Then, Nathaniel, when did you last take your wife somewhere she actually wanted to go? He opened his mouth, closed it. I don't mean social functions, Catherine said. I mean somewhere she wanted, not somewhere the household required or society expected, somewhere Eleanor wanted. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Eleanor watched him work through it, watched the careful, controlled face do something it rarely did, which was let the work show. I don't know, he said. You don't know because you never asked. Catherine said, not cruelly. Your father never asked me either. He assumed comfort and order were the same thing as care. They're not. She picked up her pen. I suggest you ask. She went back to her writing. The conversation apparently was over. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. She looked at him. They were alone in the room in the way you can be alone with someone even when a third person is present, and she felt the particular weight of his attention. Really his attention undivided, not the social performance of husbandly notice. Eleanor, he said. Yes. Is there somewhere you've wanted to go that you haven't gone? She held the question the way she'd held everything today, carefully testing its weight. The library at Harvard, she said at last. There's a collection of maps, old ones, from the first settlements. I read about it in the Athenaeum catalog 3 years ago, and I've thought about it a dozen times since. He blinked. That's not a difficult thing to arrange. No, she said. It isn't. He stared at her, and she saw the exact moment it arrived, the realization that the thing hadn't been difficult, And he had never asked, and she had never asked, because she'd been too busy teaching herself not to want things that weren't offered. And the gap between those two facts was enormous, and had been entirely unnecessary. "Next week," he said. "Before the survey, I'll write to the dean." She nodded. Her throat was tight in a way she didn't entirely trust herself with. "Thank you, Eleanor." He took one step toward her. She didn't move back. He said very quietly, "I owe you more than maps." "You do," she agreed. "I'm aware. I know you're aware." She looked at him steadily. "Awareness isn't the same as change." "No." His voice was rough at the edges. "But it's where change starts." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she said, "I'm going to see about dinner." And she walked out of the library past the window where the afternoon light was doing something golden and generous, past the east corridor where the wildflowers were fresh again, and she went to the kitchen, and she stood there for a moment with both hands flat on the table, and she breathed. Martha looked at her. "Ma'am?" "I'm fine," Eleanor said. "You sure?" "No," she said honestly. "But I will be." Martha put the kettle on without another word. Catherine Graves came to the kitchen door 20 minutes later, which was deeply unusual because Catherine Graves did not, in Eleanor's understanding, visit kitchens, and she stood in the doorway and said, "He's in the study. He's been sitting in the chair by the window for 15 minutes, which means he's thinking past what he's comfortable with. He always sat in that chair when something required more of him than he knew how to give." Eleanor looked up. "You've been watching." "I've been watching since I arrived." Catherine's voice was matter-of-fact. "Eleanor, my son has spent 34 years learning to protect himself from the risk of caring too much. You have spent 14 months learning to protect yourself from the risk of wanting too much. You're both in the same chair in a manner of speaking." She paused. "Someone has to stand up first." "That's a great deal of pressure," Eleanor said. "Yes, life applies a great deal of it." Catherine straightened. "He wrote to me in April. I didn't tell you this morning because I wanted to understand you better before I shared it." She met Eleanor's eyes. "He wrote that he was afraid he had made a serious mistake. Not in the marriage, in how he had treated it. He said—" She paused, and something in her voice went briefly and unexpectedly soft. "He said he couldn't remember the last time he had made Eleanor laugh, and that he was not certain he had ever tried." The kitchen was very quiet. "He wrote that in April," Eleanor said. "April 15th. April 15th. 2 weeks after March, after the McAllister children and the rosebush." She sat with that, with what it meant that he had known and had not changed, and the gap between knowing and changing was apparently so enormous for this particular man that it had taken another man noticing her for the knowledge to move into action. "Is that supposed to make me feel better or worse?" she asked. "Neither," Catherine said. "It's supposed to make you feel informed." She turned to go. "Sleep well, Eleanor. Tomorrow is going to require everything you have." She left. Eleanor looked at Martha, who had been very carefully focusing on the kettle for the last 4 minutes. "Martha?" "Ma'am?" "What's in tomorrow's calendar?" Martha hesitated, just briefly. "The Webbs are calling in the morning, and Mrs. Hargrove sent a note this afternoon. She's postponed to Thursday." She set the cup down. "And there was a card, arrived by messenger this evening just before dinner, from a Mr. Elias Penn." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Penn. Yes, ma'am." Martha's face was carefully neutral. "He's requested a private meeting. With you. He says it concerns information about the Graves Mill contracts that you, not Mr. Graves, ought to be aware of." The quiet in the kitchen took on a different quality. Eleanor set down her cup. "Bring me the card," she said. Penn's card was plain, no flourish, no formal seal, just his name engraved cleanly, and 4 lines of handwriting on the back that Eleanor read 3 times before she folded it and put it in her pocket. "Mrs. Graves, I apologize for the directness. There is a matter concerning the Charlestown Mill contracts which I believe you should know before Thursday's Webb dinner. It is not my place to involve myself, and yet I find I cannot in conscience remain uninvolved." If you are willing to meet briefly publicly at the Athenaeum reading room tomorrow at 10, I will explain what I know. Burn this card if it's easier. I will understand. She didn't burn it. She read it a fourth time, and then she went upstairs and she stood outside the study door open, as it had been more often lately, as if some unconscious part of Nathaniel had decided that doors had been the problem all along, and she listened to the sound of his pen moving on paper. She could tell him tonight. Walk in right now and hand him the card and let him handle it, which was what most wives in her position would do, and what every instinct trained into her, by 14 months of careful, invisible management told her was the correct and orderly thing. She went to bed instead, not because she was hiding it, because she needed to understand it first. She had learned from her father, from the long, slow education of watching a man make catastrophic decisions, with information he hadn't bothered to digest, that the difference between useful knowledge and dangerous knowledge was entirely in how you carried it before you acted. She lay in the dark, and she thought about Elias Penn, who was sharp and direct and had noticed things at a dinner table that most men missed entirely, and she thought about Harrison Webb, who had been at every significant event for 3 weeks, and had a particular way of looking at Nathaniel that she had filed and not yet named. And she thought about what it meant that Penn had addressed the card to her, specifically not to Mr. Graves. By morning, she knew what she was going to do. The Athenaeum reading room at 10 was quiet and respectable, and public enough that nothing improper could be suggested, which was, she suspected, exactly why Penn had chosen it. He was already there when she arrived, standing near the periodical shelves with a book he wasn't reading. And he saw her, and came forward with the directness she'd identified at dinner as his defining quality. "Mrs. Graves, thank you for coming." "Mr. Penn." She chose a table near the window where they could be clearly seen from the main floor. "Sit down and tell me what you know. Plainly, please." He sat. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't hesitation, but organization, the way a man who thinks clearly takes one breath before he speaks to make sure the first word is the right one. "Harrison Webb," he said, "has been collecting information about your household for 6 months. Not about the business, about you, about your marriage, about the gap between you and your husband." Eleanor kept her face perfectly still. "For what purpose?" "He has a competing bid on the Charlestown mill contracts. Nathaniel's bid is stronger on paper. So Webb has been building a different kind of argument, the kind you make in drawing rooms rather than boardrooms." Penn looked at her directly. "He's been suggesting to anyone with influence over the contract decision that a man who cannot maintain order in his own domestic life cannot be trusted with a major industrial investment. That the Graves household is, his word, unstable." "Unstable," she repeated. He cited Captain Aldridge's visits, the frequency of them. "The fact that you and Aldridge have been seen in conversation at multiple events without Nathaniel present." Penn's voice was careful and without judgment. "He has not said anything explicit. He doesn't need to. In this city, suggestion is sufficient." She heard it, the full shape of it. Webb hadn't manufactured a scandal, he'd simply pointed at the existing silence of her marriage and let other people's imaginations do the work. "Who has he spoken to?" she asked. "Commissioner Calloway, Judge Morton, 2 members of the Contracts Board." Penn paused. "And he is hosting a dinner on Thursday specifically to consolidate those conversations before the board votes on Friday." The Thursday dinner. The one Nathaniel had accepted. The one she had assumed was ordinary. "He invited Nathaniel to the dinner," she said. "Yes. Knowing Nathaniel doesn't know any of this." "Correct. He intends to use Nathaniel's presence at the dinner as evidence of confidence that Nathaniel walked into the room and had no idea the ground had been prepared against him." Penn folded his hands on the table. "He'll be subtle. He won't attack. He'll simply let the room's existing impressions do the work." Eleanor sat with that for one moment. Just one. Then she said, "How do you know all of this?" "Because Webb offered to me a share of the counterbid," Penn said flatly. "He assumed, since I arrived with the Aldridge party and had no prior relationship with your husband, that I would be amenable." He met her eyes. "I'm not. I found the offer offensive, and I found his methods using a woman's position in her household as a financial weapon against her husband particularly offensive." "Why come to me?" she said. "Why not go to Nathaniel directly?" Penn was quiet for a moment. "Because Nathaniel Graves is a proud man who will receive this information and immediately attempt to handle it by himself through direct confrontation, which will alert Webb to the breach and cost him the advantage." He paused. "Whereas you, if I'm reading you correctly, and I believe I am, will think first act second, and choose the method that is most effective rather than most satisfying." He looked at her. "Was I wrong to come to you?" "No," she said quietly. "You weren't wrong." She stood. He stood. "Mrs. Graves." He offered his hand, which was not the usual social form, but was genuine, the gesture of one equal to another. "Whatever you decide to do, I'll support it. I have no stake in this, except that the right thing should happen." She shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Penn." She left the Athenaeum and walked home at a pace that was faster than her usual, not because she was panicked. She was not panicked, but because she had a great deal to arrange before Thursday, and she preferred not to waste the morning. She told Nathaniel that night. She walked into the study fully this time, not pausing in the doorway, and she closed the door behind her, which she had not done in 14 months, and she sat in the chair across from his desk, and she put Penn's card on the desk in front of him and waited while he read it. He read it twice. Then he looked up. "Who is Penn to you?" he asked. "A man who chose his conscience over a profitable offer." She met his gaze. "He was approached by Webb with a share of the counterbid. He refused and came to me instead." "Why you and not me?" She had expected this question. "Because he believed I would think before I acted. He wasn't sure you would." Something moved through Nathaniel's expression. Not offense, which was what she'd half expected, but a particular, uncomfortable kind of recognition. "He isn't wrong," Nathaniel said. "No, he isn't." She folded her hands in her lap. "Webb has been using our marriage as leverage, specifically the appearance of distance between us. He pointed at Aldridge's visits and the fact that we have been seen operating separately in public for most of our marriage, and he let the contracts board draw their own conclusions." Nathaniel's jaw was tight. His pen lay on the desk where he'd set it when she came in, and his hand was flat beside it, that effortful stillness again, the kind that meant the controlled surface was working very hard. "How long?" he said. 6 months. 6 months. He stood, moved to the window. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." "I should have." "Yes." She said it quietly, but without softening. "You should have. You should have noticed what our household looked like from the outside, because I noticed it, and I didn't have the power to address it alone. I need you to hear that clearly, Nathaniel, not as an accusation, as a fact." He turned from the window. His face was doing the thing it had started doing recently, not composing itself, just existing, all the working parts visible. She found it both harder and easier to look at than the mask. "I hear it," he said. "What are you going to do about Thursday?" "I'm going to..." He stopped. Started again. "What do you think we should do?" The "we" landed like something solid and new in the middle of the room. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Attend the dinner, both of us, and give Webb nothing to point at." She paused. "Nathaniel, the only weapon he has is the appearance of distance. If that appearance is wrong, if the room sees something different, his entire argument collapses. He built it on an assumption that is no longer accurate." "Is it no longer accurate?" She held his gaze. "That depends on what you do between now and Thursday." He crossed the room. Not all the way to her, he stopped at the corner of the desk, close enough that she could see the exact line of tension in his shoulders. "Tell me what to do." "I can't tell you that." "Eleanor, I can't, because if I tell you, you'll do it correctly, and it will look exactly like what it is, which is a performance. And the room will know the difference." She stood. They were 4 feet apart. "It can't be strategy. If it's going to work, if we are going to work, it has to be real." He looked at her, and the silence between them had the quality of something at a tipping point, balanced on its own edge. "What if I don't know how?" he said. The admission was raw, unpolished, the kind of thing a man says when he's stopped caring about how it sounds. What if I've been closed off long enough that I genuinely don't know how to, Eleanor? I don't know how to do this. I know, she said. That's not reassuring. It isn't meant to be. It's meant to be honest. She took one step toward him. You know how to build things. You know how to start a thing from a foundation and construct it deliberately, one decision at a time. That is something you are very good at. She watched his face. Start there. He looked at her, and something happened in his expression that she had never seen from him in 14 months. Never once, something that had no name in the language of composed armored men. Something that had been behind the wall all along, pressing outward, waiting for the wall to develop enough cracks to let it through. He said, I don't want the marriage we've had. Neither do I, she said. I want... He stopped. The word want appeared to cost him something significant. I want to know the sound of your laugh. I want to know what you see when you look at the harbor. I want to know about the maps at Harvard and what made you think about them at 3 a.m, and I want... His voice had gone rough. I want to be the person who knows those things, not because it's correct, because I want to know you, and I should have wanted that from the beginning, and I wasted 14 months of it on... Nathaniel. She said it gently, not to stop him, but to slow him. One thing at a time. He breathed, steadied. Saturday, she said. The botanical excursion. Be there. Actually be there. Not performing attendance, actually present. I'll be there. And between now and Thursday, talk to me. About the mill. About what you need. Let me help you think through it instead of deciding I wouldn't understand. You understand more than I gave you credit for. Considerably more. My father was in shipping for 30 years. I sat at his table for 18 of them. She let that settle. I know what a contract board responds to and what it doesn't. I know how to read a room. I know things you haven't asked me about once in 14 months. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they had the look of a man who had put something heavy down and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. Will you sit with me? He said. Now, tonight. Tell me what you see in this situation, all of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled the other chair close to the desk and sat, and he sat across from her. And for the first time since their wedding, they put their heads together over the same problem, and she talked, and he listened. And when she was done, he asked questions that were real questions that wanted her actual answers, and she gave them. They were in the study until past midnight. Martha, coming to check the lights at 11, found them still talking and went back to bed without saying anything at all, because she was a woman of considerable wisdom. Saturday arrived with high summer heat and the particular clarity of a Boston morning that decides to be beautiful simply because it can. Eleanor was ready at 9:30. Nathaniel came down at 15:15 earlier than requested, which she noted without commenting on, and he looked at her in the blue silk again, which she had worn deliberately, and said, You wore it again. Do you object? No. He held the door. It suits you. Small. It was a small thing, but she felt it nonetheless. The Aldridge party met them at the Botanical Gardens entrance. Aldridge, the Pemberton sisters' pen, and 2 others whose names she learned on the walk-in. Aldridge shook Nathaniel's hand and said nothing. Pointed, which was more eloquent than anything he could have said. Penn caught Eleanor's eye briefly and gave one small nod. She returned it. They walked. They talked. Nathaniel stayed near her, not performing it simply near the way a man is near something he has decided matters. When Mrs. Pemberton drew Eleanor away to look at something she'd spotted among the specimens, Nathaniel moved with the group, but kept her in his peripheral vision, and she knew it because she felt it the same way she'd always felt his attention, only now it was directed rather than absent. She was explaining something about the specimen labels to Penn when she heard the voice behind her. Harrison Webb. Mrs. Graves. What a pleasant coincidence. She turned. He was with 2 men she recognized from the contracts board, Judge Morton, Commissioner Calloway, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has arranged a coincidence and is now performing surprise. He looked at her, then past her to where Nathaniel stood with Aldridge, and his expression did something quick and involuntary there, and gone. "Mr. Webb," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Are you a member of the Botanical Society? I don't recall seeing you at the spring exhibition." I accompanied the judge. He smiled. "You're looking well. And Nathaniel is here. I hadn't expected him. I understood he had the warehouse survey this weekend." "He rearranged it." She kept her voice warm and unconcerned. "We had a commitment we both wanted to keep." Morton said, "Glad to see you both out, Mrs. Graves. The Graves household is always good company." "We try to be." She smiled at Morton, then at Calloway. "Commissioner, I've been meaning to ask you about the harbor expansion survey my husband mentioned. You had some concerns about the eastern approach. I'd love to hear your thoughts before Thursday. I have some material from my father's shipping records that might be relevant." Calloway blinked. "Your father's records?" "He ran the Whitmore shipping line for 30 years. He surveyed that approach in 1799 and again in 1804. I still have the documentation." She tilted her head slightly. "The sedimentation patterns he recorded would be directly applicable to the current expansion discussion, I'd think. Nathaniel and I have been reviewing them together this week." Webb's smile had gone very still. Calloway said, "I would be very interested to see that material. I'll bring copies Thursday." She glanced at Webb. "You're attending the Webb dinner Thursday, Commissioner?" "I am." "Wonderful. We'll all be there." She looked at Webb with an expression of perfect, uncomplicated friendliness. "I imagine it'll be quite a full evening." Webb looked at her. For one moment, just one, the social surface dropped, and she saw the calculation underneath it, the rapid reassessment of a man who has just discovered that the position he thought was empty is occupied. "Indeed," he said. Nathaniel appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him approach. He moved quietly when he chose to. He shook Webb's hand, exchanged the right words with Morton and Calloway, and then his hand found the small of her back. Not possessively, not performatively, quietly. A hand that knew where it belonged and had decided to act accordingly. She felt it through the fabric of the dress. She kept her face calm and her voice steady, and she thought, there it is. That's real. Webb saw it. She watched him see it. She watched the particular calculation behind his eyes reconfigure itself around a fact that had not been present in any of his 6 months of preparation. They walked on. The hand stayed. Penn fell into step beside Eleanor when the group spread out ahead of them, and he said under his breath, "You mentioned the shipping records." "Yes." "Do you actually have them?" "Every logbook from 1797 to 1809. My father kept meticulous records. I packed them myself when we sold the house." She didn't look at him. "They're in the East Wing cedar chest. I've known about the sedimentation data for years. I simply hadn't had reason to mention it to anyone." Penn was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mrs. Graves, you are genuinely alarming." "Thank you," she said. "I've worked at it." Nathaniel caught up to them. He'd stopped briefly to speak with Aldridge and fell into step on her other side. The three of them walked in comfortable silence for a moment, which was a strange thing after all the noise of the last several days, and Eleanor felt the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being flanked by people who were simply present without wanting anything from her. "Webb," Nathaniel said quietly. "Handled," Eleanor said. "I saw." And he was quiet. Then, "You brought up your father's records." "Yes." "I didn't know you had them." "You didn't ask." She glanced at him. "Not to wound, just accurately. I'm going to stop keeping track of all the things you didn't ask about, by the way. It isn't a useful habit for either of us." "Fair?" He looked straight ahead. "What else don't I know about?" She considered it. "I can read French. I understand the basics of a shipping ledger. I have strong opinions about the Eastern Harbor approach that differ from Calloway's, and which I believe I can support with documentation. I prefer mornings to evenings. I'm afraid of nothing you've shown me in this marriage, but I'm very afraid of continuing to be invisible in it." He said nothing for a moment. They walked. Penn had drifted politely ahead, a quality she was coming to appreciate about him. "That last thing," Nathaniel said. "Yes? Are you still afraid of that, or is it past tense?" She felt the question land in her chest, the specific way important questions land. "Ask me again after Thursday," she said. He nodded. He didn't push. She was beginning to understand that the new version of him, the one who was trying, who was building deliberately from the foundation up, was learning to hold questions without needing their immediate resolution, and that this was hard for him in a way she wanted to honor rather than dismiss. "Eleanor." His voice was low enough that only she could hear it. "Yes, that day in the carriage, when I said I was afraid to try to understand you." He kept his eyes forward. "I meant it. I want you to know I meant it, and not I didn't say it as a strategy. I said it because it was true, and I had finally run out of the particular pride that makes men pretend they're not afraid of things." "I know," she said. "I believed you." Did it help, knowing it? She thought about the question seriously the way he deserved. "It helped me understand you better. It didn't fix anything. Understanding why a cage was built doesn't make it less of a cage." He flinched, slightly. She saw it. "But," she said, "it makes it possible to imagine taking it apart." She paused. "That's not nothing." He breathed. "No, it isn't." They reached the end of the path where the group had gathered, and Aldridge was telling some story that had the Pemberton sisters laughing, and Penn was looking at something in one of the display cases, with the focused attention he gave to most things, and the summer morning was bright and relentless and alive. Nathaniel said quietly, "I'm going to be honest with you about the mill situation. All of it. Tonight." "All right. And I'm going to listen to what you think. Actually listen. All right?" And then, he paused. "Eleanor, I need you to know, whatever happens Thursday, whatever Webb does or doesn't do, I'm not letting him use our marriage against us again because there isn't. I won't allow the version of this marriage that he's been pointing at to be the real one. Do you understand what I'm saying?" She looked at him. Full on, no careful sidelong calculation. Just looked at him the way she had stopped letting herself look at him somewhere around December, when hope had become too expensive to carry openly. "I understand," she said. "Good." He met her eyes. "Because I intend to give that room something very different to look at on Thursday, and I need you with me. Not behind you. Beside me." He said it without hesitation. "Beside me. That's what I meant." She held his gaze for one long moment. Then, something happened in her chest that was not yet trust. Trust was built over time, and they both knew that, but was something earlier than trust, something that came before it. The thing that makes trust possible. "Then we walk in together," she said. "Together," he said. Aldridge's voice cut through the morning. "Nathaniel, the commissioner wants to know your opinion on the sedimentation issue, and your wife has apparently been holding documentation that changes the entire conversation." And Nathaniel turned toward him with an expression Eleanor had not seen on his face in company before. He was smiling, genuinely, fully, without performing anything at all. She stood and looked at it for just a moment before they walked forward. She would remember it later, that smile on that morning, with the summer heat pressing down, and the harbor visible in the distance, and 14 months of silence finally beginning to find its way towards something worth saying. But she didn't let herself feel it entirely yet. Thursday was still ahead of them, and Eleanor Whitmore Graves had learned early and well that the most dangerous moment was never the problem. It was the breath between the problem and the outcome, when everything was still possible in both directions. She walked forward. Whatever came next, she would be ready for it. She always was. Thursday came in like a verdict. Eleanor was up before dawn. Not because she couldn't sleep, she had slept solidly. The sleep of someone who has made her decisions and laid them down, but because the day required preparation, and she intended to be prepared. She had the shipping logs open on the morning room table by 6. Her father's handwriting covered page after page. Neat, deliberate columns of numbers and observations that she had memorized years ago and could still read the way other women read sheet music. She selected the relevant pages, marked the key entries, and made clean copies of the sedimentation surveys from 1799 and 1804 in her own hand. Nathaniel found her at 6:30. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the table covered in documents. "You've been up for hours," he said. "The 1804 survey has 3 pages that directly address Calloway's concerns about the Eastern Channel. I want to have them clean before tonight." She kept writing. "Coffee is in the kitchen." Martha left it early. He went for the coffee and came back with 2 cups. And he sat at the other end of the table and picked up one of the original logbooks and began to read without being invited to. She noticed. She said nothing. She kept writing. 20 minutes passed in that particular quiet, the productive kind, the kind that happens between people who have stopped performing industry at each other and started actually working. "Your father surveyed this twice in 5 years, Nathaniel said. "He didn't trust a single measurement. He said the harbor moved." He was right. The Eastern Channel has shifted 18 inches since Calloway's last official survey. She looked up. "I know. The 1804 notes show the early movement. That's why I marked those pages." She paused. "If you bring the official survey documents from your office, the current ones, we can cross-reference the shift against his projections." He looked at her across the table. Something in his face was working. "You've been sitting on information that would have changed the entire contract conversation." "I've been sitting on it because no one asked me to the table," she said. Not bitterly, not pointedly. Just plainly the way pen spoke plainly, the way she had been trying to speak for weeks now. "I'm at the table today, so let's use it." He left for his office at 7 and came back at 8 with 3 folders under his arm and the expression of a man walking into something he has decided he deserves to be part of. They worked through breakfast. Catherine appeared at 9, looked at the table covered in documents, looked at the 2 of them bent over a survey map with their heads nearly touching, and left without a word. Eleanor heard her an hour later telling Martha that she would need her trunk repacked by tomorrow morning. She had decided to stay an extra day. At noon, Nathaniel sat back in his chair. "Calloway is going to understand this immediately. He's an engineer first and a commissioner second." He looked at Eleanor. "Morton will take longer. He responds to consensus, not data. Not Todd. Morton responds to whoever Calloway trusts," she said. "Get Calloway convinced early in the evening and Morton will follow before the second course." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know that?" "I've watched them together at 3 separate functions." She organized the copied pages into a clean stack. "Calloway speaks, Morton nods. Always. They've known each other since boyhood, and Morton has been deferring since then." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "Eleanor, how many things like this do you know about the people in our social world?" She considered it. "Most of them," she said. "I've had a great deal of time to observe and very little to do with the observations." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, not quite something shorter and more rueful. "I have wasted a significant strategic advantage." "Yes," she agreed. "But we're using it now." They arrived at Webb's dinner at 7 sharp. Not fashionably late. Not demonstratively early. Exactly on time, which was its own kind of statement from a man like Nathaniel Graves, who understood that precision communicated confidence in a way that eagerness never could. The room turned when they came in. Eleanor felt it, the collective adjustment of attention, the subtle repositioning of bodies and conversations, and she understood it. Word had moved the way word always moved in Boston society, faster than any carriage, and with considerably less mercy. People had heard things. Some had heard Webb's version. Others had heard something newer, something that had been generated by the sight of Nathaniel's hand at the small of her back at the Botanical Gardens, or by Calloway mentioning over supper the previous evening that Mrs. Graves apparently had shipping documentation that changed the harbor conversation entirely. The room had come to the dinner with questions. Eleanor intended to answer them. Nathaniel kept his hand at her back as they crossed the room toward their host. Webb received them with a smile that was controlled and a handshake that was firm and Eleanor watched his eyes conduct their rapid assessment and come back slightly less certain than they'd started. "Nathaniel, Mrs. Graves." He held her hand the correct half-second. "I'm so glad you're both here. Wouldn't miss it," Nathaniel said. His voice was easy genial, carrying the particular brand of warmth he used when he wanted a room to relax around him. "Eleanor was just telling me the Hargrove party may be late some business with the south carriage." "Ah." Webb glanced at her. "You spoke with the Hargroves today. Mrs. Hargrove called this afternoon." Eleanor smiled. "She wanted to know if we'd be attending. She and I have been corresponding about the Ladies' Society autumn collection. She's been very generous with her time." She paused just slightly. She mentioned that Commissioner Calloway had said something interesting at supper last evening about the harbor documentation. Webb's smile held, barely. "Did she? She's very interested in the Eastern Channel question. Her late husband had investments there." Eleanor released the information cleanly without emphasis, like setting a chess piece down. "Shall we find our seats? I believe we're near Calloway." They moved into the room. She felt Webb's gaze on her back for 3 full steps before social necessity pulled it away. Calloway found them before the first course. He shook Nathaniel's hand and then turned to Eleanor with an expression she recognized as genuine interest, combined with professional respect, which was a combination she had rarely received from men on the contract board, and which she intended to earn completely. "Mrs. Graves, the surveys your husband mentioned. I brought copies." She produced the clean pages from the small portfolio she'd carried, in which had drawn 1 or 2 glances, but no comments, because it looked like a perfectly ordinary accessory. She laid the marked pages on the side table between them. "Here the 1804 Eastern Approach Survey. The sedimentation measurement at the base marker. And here," she pointed, "the projection my father noted in the margin. He expected an 18-inch shift over 30 years. Calloway bent over the page. His breathing changed. She heard it. "This is the base marker at point 7, he said. "Yes. That's exactly where our current survey shows the discrepancy." He looked up. "Your father predicted this in 1804. He'd been watching it move for 7 years by then. He trusted patterns more than single measurements." She kept her voice informational, not triumphant. "The current survey assumes a stable channel. My father's record suggests that assumption is structurally incorrect, and that any major investment in the Eastern Approach should account for continued movement." Calloway straightened and looked at Nathaniel with an expression that had shifted considerably in Eleanor's favor. "Your wife has just solved a problem we've been arguing about for 4 months." "I know," Nathaniel said. "She frequently does." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the straightforward ease of someone stating a simple fact, and she felt it go through her, like water through cracked earth, the long-denied thing finding its way in. The first course was served. The conversation moved. Eleanor watched the room the way she always watched rooms, with her full peripheral attention, cataloging, adjusting, and she tracked Webb's movements across the dinner with the precision she'd been trained to all her life, without anyone telling her it was training. He spent 20 minutes with Morton before the second course. Morton was nodding. She watched it and felt the evening's balance shift a fraction in the wrong direction, because whatever Webb was saying, he was saying it with the practiced confidence of a man who still believed his position was intact. Penn appeared at her elbow between courses. "Morton," he said quietly, "I see it. Webb is telling him the Whitmore shipping records are pre-surveyed outdated, and that Calloway's enthusiasm is being influenced by—" He paused. "By what?" "By social goodwill toward a woman in a difficult situation." Penn kept his voice completely level. "He's suggesting Calloway is being gentlemanly rather than rigorous." The particular brilliance of it hit her cleanly. Webb couldn't attack the data, so he was attacking the data's source. Not the information, her standing her credibility, the implication that a bankrupt merchant's daughter playing at expertise should be humored rather than believed. She set down her fork. "Mr. Penn," she said. "Yes. You mentioned you have documentation of Webb's approach to you." "I have a written record of his offer, yes. I noted it down immediately after he made it, including the names of the board members he'd already approached and what he'd represented to them. Would you be willing to share it with Commissioner Calloway before dessert? Penn looked at her steadily. I've been waiting for you to ask, he said. She looked across the table at Nathaniel, who had been listening without appearing to listen, a skill she was discovering he possessed to a degree that impressed her. His eyes found hers. She tipped her head almost imperceptibly toward Morton's end of the table. He understood. She saw him understand it. 1 year ago, she would not have believed he could read her. Tonight he read her in a quarter second and acted on it. He stood, excused himself to the guests on his left, and walked the length of the table to where Morton sat. He sat in the empty chair beside him. He began to speak. She watched Morton's face. Penn beside her said quietly, "I'll find Calloway." He went. She sat and breathed and watched the room recalibrate itself around new information, which was the thing rooms always did, the thing she had always been able to see, and had never until this week had the standing to influence. Webb saw it. She knew the moment he saw it, the moment he understood that the board members he had spent 6 months cultivating were being spoken to simultaneously by Nathaniel Graves and Elias Penn, and that both conversations appeared to be going very well. He crossed the room toward her. She had expected this too. "Mrs. Graves?" He sat in the empty chair Penn had left. His smile was the careful, controlled one. "I hope the evening is treating you well." "Very well, thank you." She met his eyes. "And you, Mr. Webb, is the dinner going as you'd hoped?" The question was so direct and so pleasant that he paused for just a fraction of a second too long. "Always a pleasure to host," he said. "Indeed." She folded her hands on the table. "I want to be direct with you, Mr. Webb, because I find directness saves a great deal of time." She kept her voice conversational, even warm. "I know what you've been saying about my household. I know who you've said it to. And I know that Mr. Penn was approached with a share of your counterbid, which he declined and documented." She paused. "None of this will become a public matter tonight. I have no interest in scenes or accusations. But I want you to understand that the information exists and that the people in this room who matter to the contract decision are, as of this evening, in possession of it." Webb was very still. "That's a significant claim," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It's also an accurate one. You have no standing in a business matter. I have standing as a person who was used as a tool in one." Her voice didn't rise, didn't harden. "You decided that the distance in my marriage was a weapon you could borrow. You were wrong about the distance, and you were wrong to borrow it." She looked at him with the calm that came from having already decided everything that needed deciding. "I suggest you focus the remainder of the evening on the actual merits of your proposal. That's the contest I believe you originally intended to have." She stood. He didn't. She walked away from him without looking back, and she did not shake, and she did not hurry, and she crossed the room to where Nathaniel was still talking to Morton, and she sat beside her husband, and he moved his chair slightly to close the gap between them, and she put her copied pages on the table and picked up the conversation at exactly the right moment. And Morton looked between them with the expression of a man who is reconsidering several things simultaneously. The dessert course came. The evening moved toward its close, and when the guests began to disperse and Nathaniel steered her toward the door with his hand, certain and steady at her back, she heard Morton say to Calloway behind them, "The Graves proposal, I think we vote Friday." Calloway said, "I think we vote for it." She didn't let herself react until they were in the carriage. Then she exhaled a long, full breath that released something she'd been holding since 6 o'clock that morning. Nathaniel was watching her. "You all right?" "Yes." She looked at her hands. "Are you?" "I'm..." He paused. "I watched you handle Webb. I saw you handle Morton. I had less to work with." His voice was quiet. "Eleanor, what you said to him, about the distance, about being used. I meant it. I know you meant it." He was still for a moment. "He was able to build that argument because I gave him the material, my inattention, the way I structured our marriage." He looked at her. "He used something I created." "Yes," she said simply. But he couldn't sustain it, because the thing he was pointing at isn't there anymore. She held his gaze. That matters. He looked at her in the carriage, dark in the moving lamplight from the street, and she saw him working toward something. The thing he'd been building toward all week, one careful, deliberate piece at a time, the way he built everything. "Eleanor," he said, "I need to say something, and I need to say it correctly, so I'm asking you to let me take a moment." She waited. He took the moment. He took it seriously. She watched him find the words, the way she'd watched him work through documents at the table that morning, with full attention without shortcuts. "I chose you," he said at last, "because you were the only person I had met in 2 years who talked to me as though I were a man rather than a position. And then I married you and immediately treated you as a position rather than a person, which is the contradiction of that is not something I have an excuse for." He paused. "I know that awareness isn't change. You told me that and you were right. So I'm not asking you to believe that I've changed. I'm asking you to let me prove it. Over time. Slowly. The way things that are built to last are supposed to be built." His voice was rough at the edges. "I want to know the sound of your laugh and what you see in the harbor and every opinion you have that I've been too closed off to ask for. I want to be the person who knows those things, not because our household requires it, but because I require it. Because 14 months of living in the same house as you, and knowing almost nothing real about you, is the closest I've come to understanding what I've done to myself, and I can't continue it." She sat with every word. She let them settle where they landed. Then she said, "The Harvard Library, the maps." He blinked slightly. "Yes. I want to go Monday. I'll write to the dean Sunday. And I want to come to the mill survey, the rescheduled one." He looked at her. "The survey is 6 hours in a warehouse reviewing construction reports. I know what a survey is, Nathaniel. You want to come to a warehouse for 6 hours. I want to understand what you do. All of it." She held his gaze. "You've been living inside a version of my life for 14 months without understanding what it requires. I'd like to understand yours." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "All right. All right," she echoed. The carriage stopped. They were home. The summer night pressed warm against everything, and the Beacon Hill lamplight was gold through the carriage window, and Eleanor felt the 14 months behind her and the unknown length of time ahead of her with equal clarity, the past exactly what it had cost the future, not yet priced. She was comfortable with that. She had always been comfortable with honest uncertainty. It was false certainty that had done the damage. They went in. Catherine was in the library still at 11 o'clock with her book and her coffee and the particular patience of a woman who has arranged things and is waiting to see if they arranged correctly. She looked up when they came in. She looked at them, at whatever was visible between them, whatever the evening had built that hadn't been there at 7, and she said nothing. She simply nodded once and went back to her book. Eleanor excused herself to find Martha. Nathaniel stayed with his mother. She could hear their voices from the corridor low without urgency, the specific tenor of a conversation between people who had already covered the hard ground and were now simply being together. Martha was in the kitchen. "How did it go?" she asked. "Well." Eleanor sat. She rarely sat in the kitchen. It felt right tonight. "Penn came through. Calloway is convinced. Morton will follow. And Webb, he understood his position by desert." She picked up the teacup Martha pushed toward her. "He's not a stupid man. He'll adjust." Martha looked at her for a long moment. "And Mr. Graves." Eleanor thought about the carriage. About, "I want to be the person who knows those things." About the hand at her back steady and certain in a room full of people who were watching. "He said the right things," she said. "In the right way. Without needing to be told what the right things were." "Is that enough?" "It's a beginning." She drank her tea. "Which is what we should have had 14 months ago and didn't." "But you can't build backward. You can only build from where you are." "No," Martha agreed. You can't build backward. They sat in the easy quiet of the kitchen for a few minutes, the way women sit together when the day has been long and the outcome is cautiously good. Aldridge came by the following morning to say goodbye. His business in Boston was concluded, and his ship was waiting in the harbor. He came to the front door, which Eleanor answered herself because she was passing when he knocked, and she brought him to the morning room where Nathaniel was reading. The two men shook hands the way they had the night of the first dinner, with the ease of a long friendship, and the specific warmth of men who have between them done something worth doing. Aldridge turned to Eleanor. He took her hand, he bowed over it correctly, and then he looked up at her and said, "Mrs. Graves, it was a genuine pleasure." "Captain Aldridge." She met his eyes. "Thank you." He knew what she was thanking him for. He didn't diminish it by dismissing it. He said, "Take good care of each other. It's the only thing that actually matters." He released her hand and looked at Nathaniel. "Write me." "I'll write," Nathaniel said. He left. Eleanor watched him go, this man who had walked into a room and seen her completely and immediately and done something about it without requiring anything in return. The uncomplicated version, he had said. She was grateful for the uncomplicated version. It had done considerable work. Penn sent a note that afternoon. Brief, direct, entirely. Penn. The contracts board voted this morning. The Graves proposal carries. I thought you should know before the formal letter arrives. Congratulations, Mrs. Graves. The harbor is better for your father's records. E. Penn. She brought the note to Nathaniel in the study where he was working, and she set it on the desk in front of him and watched him read it. She watched his face. He breathed out. Slowly. Completely. Then he looked up at her and said, "Your father would have been pleased." Her throat did the tight thing it sometimes did when someone named her father with straightforward kindness rather than careful avoidance of the subject. "Yes," she said. "He would have." Nathaniel stood. He crossed to where she was standing. He was close, genuinely close, not the social performance of proximity, but the real thing, the kind that required a decision. "The maps," he said. "Monday." "Monday," she confirmed. "And I want to tell you something before then." He looked at her steadily. "I spoke to my mother last night, after you went up. I heard you. She told me she said that the day you moved the mirror in the hall, she knew you were going to be all right in this house." He paused. "She said a woman who sees that a light is wrong and fixes it without asking permission is a woman who knows how to live." Eleanor thought about the mirror. The 18 inches. The morning she'd done it 6 months ago without thinking because the light was wrong and it bothered her, and the waiting for someone to notice and fix it was simply too impractical. "She didn't tell me that this morning," Eleanor said. "She wouldn't. She'd tell me instead and trust me to pass it along." A small, genuine curve at the corner of his mouth. "She operates through intermediaries when it serves her. Like mother, like son." He caught that she saw him catch it, and she saw the flash of real humor behind his eyes, the kind that surprised him slightly by being there. "That's not entirely fair." "It's a little fair." "A little fair," he allowed. She looked at him. At this man she had married in one kind of hope and spent 14 months learning to live without, and was now standing with in a morning room in August, with the harbor visible below, and the rest of their life neither decided nor foreclosed, sitting open and possible in a way it hadn't been since before the beginning. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "What do you see when you look at the harbor?" He turned to look. She watched him look, watched him actually look, not perform, looking, not glance to satisfy the question. He looked at it for a long moment, and she saw his face do the thing it had started doing, just existing unsecured from its armor. "I see everything my grandfather wanted when he built on this hill," he said. "And then I see everything I've been too proud to want for myself." He looked back at her. "Lately I see the thing you said. Space. And I'm starting to understand why that was your answer." He paused. "But I want to change it." "Change what? Your answer?" His voice was quiet and serious, and more open than she had ever heard it. "When you look at the harbor, I want you to see something other than space. I want there to be enough of something real between us that the space fills in." He held her gaze. "That's what I'm building. That's what I'm asking for the chance to build." Catherine Graves came to the morning room door, looked at both of them, assessed the situation with the speed of a woman who had been reading rooms since before either of them was born, and said, "I'm leaving tomorrow. I'll need the carriage at 7. Then she turned and walked away, and from the corridor clearly audible, Eleanor heard her say to no one in particular, "About time." Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. The sound that came out of her was entirely involuntary and entirely genuine. A real laugh, short and bright, and surprised the kind that can't be manufactured or performed. He looked at her. He was smiling. Not the careful social expression. Not the composed public face. The full, unguarded thing directed entirely at her, staying exactly where it was. "There it is," he said quietly. She stopped laughing. She looked back at him, and the laughter settled into something warmer and more durable. Something that felt like the first morning after a long winter. Tentative and new and irrevocably present. "Yes," she said. "There it is." She picked up Pen's note from the desk. She folded it and kept it. She would keep it the way she'd kept her father's logbooks, not out of sentiment alone, but because some things were worth having physical proof of. The evidence that a thing had happened. That a moment had been real. Nathaniel held out his hand. Not an offered arm, just his hand open waiting. She took it. His fingers closed around hers with the careful steadiness of a man who has decided what he's holding and intends not to drop it, and they stood at the morning room window with the summer harbor below them, and Catherine's footsteps fading down the corridor, and the whole long, imperfect future stretching out ahead. Eleanor Whitmore Graves looked at the harbor and did not see space. For the first time in 14 months, for the first time, if she was honest, in longer than that, she looked at the water and saw exactly where she was. And where she was at last was home.